finished up chapter 1 of Ruth last week. But before we get into Ruth chapter 2, I would like to briefly repeat and summarize a key point from that last lesson. And it is that when a Gentile accepts the God of Israel, he or she is also to accept God's people, the Israelites, as his brethren. Today we call those people Jews. And this is because God makes a spiritual connection between the convert and the Hebrew. So let me also prepare you for today's lesson by saying that while a couple of lessons ago I was pretty preachy, and last week I was pretty teachy, today I'm going to get a little techie. All right? I hope you like it. Now, last time I pointed out this mysterious reality of an inherent but difficult to define relationship that's created between natural-born Hebrews and natural-born Gentiles who come to faith in the God of the Hebrews. And we'll even see this from another perspective in today's lesson. Now, we saw this when I broke down Ruth's promise to her mother-in-law, Na'omi, into one statement of faith, your God will be my God, accompanied by 5 promises of action on her part, signaling what amounts to a visible and tangible commitment that ought to necessarily come when a Gentile makes that statement of faith and sincerely means it. Those 5 actions were, I will go wherever you go, I will stay wherever you stay. Your people will be my people, I will die where you will die, I'll be buried where you will be buried. The I in that statement is from a Gentile, and the you in that statement is to a Hebrew. So from another aspect, we have a promise from Ruth to the God of Israel that Jehovah will be Ruth's God, and a promise from Ruth to Na'omi, and in a broader sense, to the overall people of Israel, to join them in all the ways that matter. So as we go through today's lesson, I want you to take special notice of how Ruth will be referred to very often as Ruth the Moabite or Ruth the foreigner. Yet the locals of Bethlehem are aware of this switch of allegiance that Ruth has made to Jehovah and to Israel, and they are also cognizant of Ruth's very evident love, her care towards Na'omi. So calling Ruth a Moabite is not meant as a slap at her. It's not a rejection of her conversion. All right? Rather, it's just noting a fact of her background. It is that she has made a decision to leave behind Moab and its gods, to cleave to Israel and its God. Okay? And that she is not a biological Hebrew. That's also accepted by the people. And yet, while she's not a physical ethnic Jew, she now has a Jewish heart or soul, so to speak, as a result of her acceptance of the God of Israel. I mean, for many of us, we came from a church at one point in our lives. How often have we heard that word at pretty much whatever denomination you were in? The God of Israel, the God of Israel, the God of Israel. And yet the Israel just seems to get chopped off in our minds. It's never a part of our faith. So the question is, Is Ruth now a Jew? Or is she still a Moabite Gentile living among the Jews? Or is she a strange kind of hybrid? Now, this is quite a relevant issue for the mostly Gentile church of today, especially with the return of Israel as a reborn nation that confronts, and all this confronts many cherished Christian doctrines. At the heart of the matter is this: exactly how, with whom, does a Gentile Christian identify him or herself once we accept that God of Israel? This was an immediate concern among the Jewish leadership who followed Messiah Yeshua, as it was also for their Gentile Christian converts following Christ's death. So, of course, we see this same dilemma recorded and discussed in the New Testament. And Paul addresses it in detail, actually. In the book of Romans, Paul says this. This is from Romans chapter 2, starting at verse 25. For circumcision is indeed of value if you do what the Torah says. But if you are a transgressor of Torah, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the Torah, won't his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? Indeed, the man who is physically uncircumcised but obeys the Torah will stand as a judgment on you who've had a circumcision and have Torah written out but violated. For the real Jew is not merely Jewish outwardly. True circumcision is not only external and physical. On the contrary, the real Jew is one inwardly, and true circumcision is of the heart, spiritual, not literal, so that his praise comes not from other people but from God. Now, first of all, a lot of circumcisions in there. The words circumcision and uncircumcision, which really isn't even a word, fills this paragraph, doesn't it? What is this referring to? Okay, see, circumcision is the sign that a person, a male, is a Jew. Not being circumcised is the sign that a person, a male, is a Gentile. So the uncircumcised was simply an everyday epithet in the New Testament era that Jews used to refer to a Gentile. Second, how do I know that Paul is directly addressing the matter of how to regard a Gentile who comes to belief in the God of Israel versus a situation whereby perhaps a Jew is not operating within the Torah and so he's being chastised for not being spiritual enough? Put another way, do we have Paul saying that for a Jew to be a real Jew, a true Jew, he must have a circumcised heart? No, we do not have that situation, because the next verse of Paul's dissertation is Romans 3:1, and he says, well, then what advantage has the Jew? What's the value of being circumcised? Much in every way. In the first place, the Jews were entrusted with the very words of God. In other words, Paul is not asking if a Jew who is circumcised but breaks the Torah law is to no longer be considered a Jew. That is, he becomes a member of the uncircumcised, Gentiles. On the other hand, since the subject was how a Gentile who receives a circumcised heart becomes a Jew inwardly, does that also mean that from a physical standpoint, that there's no longer any distinction between a Gentile and a Jew? Some say, using a rather new doctrine that I do not subscribe to, that what Paul was getting at is that some supernatural, miraculous thing happens, and a Gentile is physically transformed into a physical Hebrew upon his acceptance of the God of Israel. Again, I think that's very contrived. It's unwarranted. It's a very unwarranted reading of this passage. In no way does it bear out in context or intent. Paul says that a real Jew is one inwardly. It comes from a miraculous, divinely performed, spiritual circumcision of the heart. Not a miraculous transformation of our human flesh. So this begs the question, how can someone become one of God's people inwardly, meaning spiritually, but reject God's people outwardly, physically? See, the theology of Ruth says you can't. And Paul's extended argument on this subject in Romans 11 also explains that Gentiles are actually grafted in, spiritually speaking, to Israel, to their covenants, and to their God by means of our trust in Messiah Yeshua. Thus, this misguided doctrine of replacement theology, or a theology that has gripped way too much of the church for too many centuries. A theology that hopes to prove that Gentiles who love Jesus have replaced the Hebrews as God's people. It's not only erroneous, it's utterly impossible. Because the circumcised heart that is received by a saved person makes that person an Israelite inwardly, from a spiritual perspective, and thus creates this bond with the physical Israelites that today we call Jews. Ruth did not waltz into Bethlehem and tell the Jewish townspeople that they're old news because now she, a Gentile, has accepted the God of Israel as her God, and so she's God's new favorite. And they can just be discarded. Indeed, Ruth is a model for the church to follow, just like nearly every Christian commentator says she is. Ruth knew that to accept the God of Israel in her heart is to accept Israel in the flesh. A little later in this lesson, we're going to see another interesting parallel between this Old Testament story of Ruth and a New Testament story of how a Gentile becomes part of Israel spiritually when they accept Israel's God. So for now, turn your Bibles to Ruth chapter 2. Ruth chapter 2. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it is page 1058. And we're going to read all of Ruth chapter 2. Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a prominent, a wealthy member of Elimelech's clan, whose name was Boaz. Now Ruth, the woman from Moab, said to Naomi, "Let me go into the field and glean ears of grain behind anyone who will allow me to." She answered her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and arrived at the field and gleaned behind the reapers. Now she happened to be in the part of the field that belonged to Boaz from Elimelech's clan when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "Adonai be with you." And they answered him, "Adonai bless you." And then Boaz asked his servant, supervising the reapers, "Whose girl is this?" And the servant supervising the reapers answered, "Well, she's a girl from Moab who returned with Na'omi from the plain of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather what falls from the sheaves behind the reapers.' So she went and has kept at it from morning until now, except for a little rest in the shelter." Well, Boaz said to Ruth, "Did you hear that, my daughter? Don't go to glean in another field. Don't leave this place, but stick here with my working girls. Keep your eyes on whichever field the reapers are working in and follow the girls. I've ordered the young men not to bother you. And whenever you get thirsty, go and drink from the water jars that the young men have filled." She fell on her face, prostrating herself, and said to him, "Why are you showing me such favor? Why are you paying attention to me? After all, I'm only a foreigner." And Boaz answered her, "Well, I've heard the whole story. Everything you've done for your mother-in-law since your husband died, including how you left your father and your mother and the land you were born in to come to a people about whom you knew nothing beforehand. May Adonai reward you for what you've done. May you be rewarded in full by Adonai, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." And she said, "My Lord, I hope I continue pleasing you. You have comforted and encouraged me, even though I'm not one of your servants." Well, when mealtime came, Boaz said to her, "Come here, have something to eat. Dip your piece of bread in the olive oil and vinegar." And she sat by the reapers, and they passed her some roasted grain, and she ate till she was full, and she had some left over. And when she got up to glean, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her glean even among the sheaves themselves, without making her feel ashamed. In fact, pull some ears of grain out from the sheaves on purpose. Leave them for her to glean. Don't rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening, and when she beat out what she had gathered, it came to about a bushel of barley. She picked it up, went back into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and Ruth brought it out and gave her what she had left over after eating her fill. And her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where were you working? Blessed be the one who took such good care of you." She told her mother-in-law with whom she had been working. She said, "The name of the man with whom I was working today is Boaz." And Na'omi said to her daughter-in-law, "Well, then may he be blessed by Adonai, who has never stopped showing grace neither to the living nor to the dead." And Na'omi also told her, "The man is closely related to us. He's one of our redeeming kinsmen." Now Ruth, the woman from Moab, said, "Moreover, he even said to me, 'Stay close to my young men until they've finished my harvest.'" And Na'omi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It's good, my daughter, for you to keep going out with his girls, so that you won't encounter hostility in some other field." So she stayed close to Boaz's girls to glean until the end of the barley and the wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, verse 1 essentially explains that Na'omi is not blood related to Boaz. Rather, Boaz is associated with Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech. The information is supplied that Boaz is a wealthy man belonging to Elimelech's clan. This reminds us of a couple of lessons ago when I explained that in the first chapter of Ruth, Elimelech's family was called Ephrathim of Bethlehem. And the Hebrew root word Ephrath means abundance, fruitful. The point being that Elimelech's clan was a fruitful, a well-to-do clan belonging to the tribe of Judah. And here, with the direct pronouncement that Boaz was wealthy and of the same clan as Elimelech, we get additional evidence that such was the case and why the nickname Ephrathim was applied to that large extended family. Now, this is one of those several places where we're going to get a little bit technical today. Where in the complete Jewish Bible it says that Naomi had a relative. In Hebrew, the word being translated is moda. Moda. So especially in some Bibles, where moda is translated into kinsman, kind of like an abbreviation for kinsman redeemer, the English translator was kind of jumping to some conclusions. Moda simply indicates a familial association or even an acquaintance. So in no way is Boaz at this point in the story being depicted as any more than a somewhat distant relative from Elimelech's clan. There is no assumption of family obligation upon Boaz towards Naomi or Ruth, anybody at this point. If you've ever had the interest to look up Boaz's name to see what it means, you probably found there's not much agreement about it. Boaz is very unique. No other Bible character shares that name. In fact, outside of the association with the book of Ruth, we find the only other use for the name Boaz is as one of the names, is the name of one of the two enormous pillars, the other one being called Yachin, that's at the entry into Solomon's temple. And even then, there's a lot of disagreement as to what it signifies. So rather than speculate, I think we'll just leave the meaning of the name Boaz as the mystery that it currently is and move on. Now, Ruth and Na'omi, well, they currently represent the poor of Bethlehem. And as widows, they have no visible means of support. So Ruth does what was the norm for that era. She decides to go out and glean. Now, gleaning was the food stamp program of ancient times. Gleaning gave the poverty-stricken the opportunity to obtain food. But what we have to keep in mind is that in this agricultural society, gleaning occurred simultaneously with harvesting. So just as a farmer has to sow, then tend, then wait for the crop to grow up and then ripen before he can harvest it and use the produce, it was the same thing for the gleaners. The poor had to work behind the reapers, the harvesters, immediately picking up what the reapers left behind, with the idea of gathering more than they could use in a single day. They would need to store up that produce, usually grain, that they gleaned to use during the bulk of the time that was the planting and then the growing cycles, when there was no gathering of food, no harvesting, therefore no gleaning occurring. Let's also be clear. Gleaning was a right of the poor. It was not a privilege. It was a right. It was not something that the field's owners could grant or not grant to gleaners according to his charity. The Torah made it God's law that a field owner must not harvest all of their crops, but rather they should leave sufficient for the poor, especially for widows. So Ruth could literally wander around and choose at her own discretion which field she might like to glean. In fact, part of the law on gleaning was that in lean times, and I love this, the owners of the fields were required to make more of their crops available to the gleaners than usual. That is quite a contrast to the typical human reaction whereby in tough times, people give less of their incomes to charity, even though the number of needy is on the rise. Verse 3 explains that Ruth happened upon a part of a field owned by Boaz to do her gleaning. Now, the Hebrew, when translated most literally, says something like, she chanced upon the field of Boaz. Now, to the uninitiated, that sounds a lot like luck, pure luck. She just happened by serendipity to pick the field that was owned by Boaz. But that's neither the Hebrew nor the heavenly meaning here. Hebrews did not believe in luck. They believed that all things were guided by God's hand. Rather, a better translation is probably by divine providence. She came to the field of Boaz. Now, I'm not saying this in result of hindsight or as allegory. That was precisely what the Jewish mindset of that era meant to convey. So the Lord guided Ruth to Boaz's field, but of course, Ruth was completely unaware that the God she only recently gave her allegiance to was behind her choice. And sometime after Ruth began her gleaning, Boaz comes out from his home in Bethlehem to check on the progress of his field workers, those he's hired to do his harvesting. In the previous verse, we are told that she came to that part of the field that was owned by Boaz. See, it was usual that fields were common fields shared by several farmers. A farmer would simply own and plant part of a field. Often some rocks would be a boundary marker between the fields. At other times, there was none at all. A farmer simply recognized where his crop began and ended. Unlike Europe, where we're going to find hedgerows that separate plots of land in a most definite way, Hebrews did not usually employ fences or barriers. On several of our trips to Israel, people on the tours we've led have asked me about all these rock fences they see in almost all the fields of Israel. But in fact, what they're looking at are walls used for terracing the hilly terrain. They're not meant to designate property lines, although I'm sure in some instances it may serve that double purpose. So Boaz comes to the field. He greets the reapers by saying, Yehovah be with you. And they respond with, Yehovah bless you. This must have been the rather standard greeting format for that local area. Now, when we remember that the time of the book of the Ruth was during the days of the judges, and we recall the spiritual darkness that hovered over Israel that typified that era, this greeting and response indicate that Bethlehem was an enclave of true worshipers of the God of Israel who continued to dedicate themselves to the purer ways rather than to give in to the rampant apostasy of the time. Boaz notices Ruth. He asks the man that was supervising his other workers about her, and he asks, who is this Nara? Who is this Nara? The term means young girl who is under somebody's charge. Perhaps she's a servant, or more typically, this was a girl who still lived at home under her father's authority. It's not a term that would be used for a married woman or for a person who was a known widow. And the field supervisor answers Boaz by referring to her as that girl from Moab, the one who returned with Na'omi. Now, this shows us that in small towns and cities, very little happens without news of it getting around. And so Ruth and Naomi's story was well known, at least among the locals. And the harvest supervisor goes on to explain to Boaz that she came to him asking to glean in this field, and she has been gleaning continuously, except just to stop for a short break. Now, there's a little bit of a twist here that can go unnoticed and get lost in translation. Verse 7 has the supervisor saying that Ruth asked if she could glean after the reapers among the sheaves. Now, this is somewhat problematic, and it's unlikely that she asked to glean among the sheaves, because that is not where gleaning takes place. Sheaves are the stalks of grain that have been cut, gathered, and bundled by the reapers. Sheaves are the stalks of grain that are the harvest, and it's the property of the owner. Not only would that have been very arrogant of a request on Ruth's part, the supervisor certainly would have rebuked her for it, possibly even suggested she try somewhere else. So what was it that she was asking? After all, the following verses show that Ruth was a very meek and humble person in both attitude and deed, and she would have been anything but disrespectful and arrogant. The problem comes from the Hebrew word used here, that either can be mirim or marim. And it stems from the fact that while these two words mean just slightly different things, they're spelled in Hebrew identically. Okay, minor detour time. Hebrew utilizes an alphabet of consonants. And a person on their own accord must add the vowel sounds to make a Hebrew word pronounceable. This was a problem even for the Jews, especially after the Roman dispersion of the Jews from the Holy Land not long after Yeshua was executed. The problem was that as the generations of young Hebrews grew up and scattered all over the Asian and European continents, even into northern Africa, and as they assimilated into the many Gentile cultures, they lost track of exactly how to pronounce many words of their formerly native Hebrew language. So especially when reading Hebrew with its all-consonant alphabet, you could vocalize a word a number of ways, depending on which vowels you decided you needed to add to it. Now, don't let that statement or concept throw you. It's actually quite similar for most languages. In our own language of English, let's take the word tear. Okay? We can vocalize it as T-E-E-R, tear, meaning the byproduct of crying. We can even vocalize that word T-E-A-R as tear, meaning to rip something, like a piece of paper. Tear or tear. The point being that although it is spelled exactly the same way, a slightly different way of saying it, changing the vowel in it, changes its meaning. And a person has to have sufficient knowledge and experience of the language and the culture and the context of the subject to know which way to say the word. Now imagine if English was an all-consonant alphabet. No A-E-I-O-U, like Hebrew. And when we read the word tear, T-E-A-R, it would have no vowels in it. So what would it be? Just T-R. That's exactly the way Hebrew works. Now what do we do? See, this is the very problem with Hebrew. You have to know by context and experience how to see a word in Hebrew and then pronounce it. But after a few hundred years of the Hebrew community being scattered and existing only in enclaves and villages among Gentiles, the experience of using the Hebrew language waned, and how to communicate the Hebrew written word so that it could still be spoken was virtually in danger of extinction. So along came a group of Jewish scribes and teachers who, over 1,000 years ago, invented a system of little symbols that they added to the Hebrew letters and words that told the reader what the vowel sounds should be, and so therefore how to pronounce it. That system is today what's called the Masoretic system, and it is incorporated into almost any Hebrew text you'll stumble across in modern times. In our case now, back to Ruth. Here in Ruth, the question is, which is correct for where it is that Ruth asked if she could glean? Would it be among the Mirim or the Marim? Many Bibles say that it is the Marim. That means bundled sheaves. But it almost certainly ought to be Mirim, which simply means stalks. That is, the stalks are either uncut because the reaper's scythe bypassed them, or they were cut and just lying there on the ground and left unbundled because the reaper's helpers didn't pick up every last stalk to make a bundle, to make a sheaf. It would be totally against Ruth's character to ask to glean among the bundled sheaves. That's just something that wasn't done. So now in verse 8, now that Boaz knows who Ruth is, what her background is, he speaks with her, and he begins with the words, "Did you hear that, my daughter?" Now there's two expressions wrapped up in one here. The first is, "Did you hear that?" And it has the sense not of actually asking her a question, just making sure that he has her full attention. It's like our saying, pay attention carefully to this, okay? The second part of the expression is, my daughter. And my daughter is not a statement that she is his daughter or even under his familial authority. It's just the way an elder speaks to a younger person affectionately. Here in Florida, which was a shock to me coming from California, any restaurant, anywhere I go, I'm called hun. My wife was not crazy about this when we first moved here. But it's just the way it happens within a certain culture. So just as we saw Na'omi refer to Ruth as my daughter in an earlier verse, now we have the equally elderly, by the way, Boaz, addressing the considerably younger Ruth in that same way. So sorry, ladies, this is not the tale of a dashing young man riding to the rescue of a lovely damsel in distress. Boaz was an old guy. So Boaz offers Ruth the chance to glean his field full time. She would not have to work this field for a while, then go on and try another one. Now, this is an interesting bit of information because she may have worked there for possibly a couple of months. Even more, we know that she arrived at the time when the barley was still being harvested, but the wheat harvest usually began when the barley harvest was nearing its end, so a new crop was available to glean almost immediately on the heels of the barley crop. That was wheat. Now, the beginning of the barley harvest comes at a certain biblical feast time called Bichrim, also known as first fruits. It was at the same time as Passover and unleavened bread. Shavuot, Pentecost, which would arrive 7 weeks later, was during the wheat harvest. So it was within this particular 7-week time frame between first fruits and Shavuot that Ruth's interaction with Boaz took place. Now, Boaz tells Ruth that he's instructed the young men who are doing the reaping, his hired workers, to allow her freedom to do her work and to not bother her. Not only that, she has been invited to drink from the same water jugs that Boaz's hired reapers can drink from. This was the summertime in Judah. It was hot. Water was critical. If a person had to stop and go get his or her own water, it would take away from gleaning time or reaping time. So by offering Ruth the opportunity to drink from the hired worker's water jug, Ruth could be more productive. This is not something that the other gleaners would have available to them. Ruth was getting special treatment. But why? Was it that maybe she was exceptionally beautiful and this old man, Boaz, was attracted to her? I can't say that that couldn't have played a role. Although, if so, I think a fairly minor one, and very probably not at all. The same question puzzled Ruth. Why all this favoritism towards her? So Ruth falls down prostrate at Boaz's feet, thanks him for his kindness, and inquires, why would he be acting so favorably to her, especially because she's a foreigner? There it is again. That reference to Ruth and to her Moabite, her Gentile heritage. And although Ruth, to Naomi's surprise, rejected her own past identity to take on a new one with Israel and Israel's God, her ethnicity as a Moabite remained with her. I mean, it was apparently physically obvious. Now, Ruth is surprised at such grace shown to her by Boaz. How she merited such a thing? In verse 11, Boaz answers her question. And I think we need to take it as an honest and truthful statement, not read anything extra into it. Boaz says it's her character that he so admires. He has now heard the stories of Naomi's Moabite daughter-in-law who came to Bethlehem with Naomi and has so devotedly cared for this old Jewish woman. Even more, he is impressed by her complete show of sincerity and unity with the Jewish people when she gave up her own people, left the comfort of her own mother and father, who could have ensured a decent and protected life for her until she got a new husband. She left behind her own nation, meaning she has switched allegiance from Moab to Israel. And even more, she has come forward to Judah without knowing anything about the Jews or even what to expect. And such is this commitment and faith that Ruth the Gentile exhibited, and this fascinated Boaz and would soon bring her great reward from the God of Israel. So Gentile Christians, take notice. I know many of you expected a nice, comfortable study of Ruth, where the standard focus was on the parallel between Boaz and the Messiah, and it's certainly there, and we'll examine it. But up to this point in Ruth, that subject is simply not present. If we're going to take the story of Ruth as a type and shadow of Christ and his church, then we need to accept the whole of the matter and take it in context, not just focus on the parts we prefer. This first part of the book of Ruth is as much about a Gentile's relationship with the people of Israel as the last part of this book is about a Gentile church and its relationship with our Jewish Savior. So Boaz blesses Ruth in verse 12 and ends his statement with an interesting wordplay that we're going to find used later on in the story in a different way, but I need to connect it for you right now so that it's not missed. Boaz says to Ruth, "May you be rewarded in full by Jehovah, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." The operative phrase is, under whose wings, at this point meaning God's wings, you have come for refuge. Now, the Hebrew word that's translated as wings is kanaf. And the usual image is of a mother bird stretching out her wings over her chicks to guard them, protect them from storms and predators. And while the idea of protection and rest is certainly intended, I think the choice of words is to draw a parallel. So I want to just briefly jump ahead to Ruth 3 and see that parallel I'm talking about. In Ruth 3, starting in verse 6, she went down to the threshing floor and did everything as her mother-in-law had instructed her. And after Boaz was through eating and drinking and was feeling good, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of grain. Now she stole in, meaning Ruth, uncovered his feet and lay down. And in the middle of the night, the man was startled. And he turned over, and there was a woman lying at his feet. And he asked, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I'm your handmaid, Ruth. Spread your robe over your handmaid because you are a redeeming kinsman." Now, this is the part of the story that most of us have heard before because it's so dramatic, and I think especially for the females among us, romantic. But look at that last sentence. It says that Ruth asked Boaz to spread his robe over your handmaid because you are a redeeming kinsman. What it actually says, with a little Hebrew added back in, is spread your kanaf over your handmaid because you are a goel. Remember, we just talked about kanaf, and it spoke about God's wings. Now it's used here about Boaz's robe. Kanaf, earlier translated metaphorically as God's wings, being spread over Ruth for her heavenly well-being, is now used in the very same way, just hidden because of the English translation, that Boaz should spread his kanaf, his wings that are metaphorically his robe, over her for her earthly well-being. And this is because Boaz is Ruth's goel, kinsman redeemer. See, the spreading of his robe over her was a cultural sign of him taking her under his wing, taking her to a place of refuge, his becoming her protector and benefactor. Now, I'm not sure if the connection is becoming clear to you, but I sure hope it is. Ruth the widow back in Moab didn't know anything about Jehovah, but God, that same God, gave her enough faith for her to know it was better for her to choose him over her own gods. But now this naive Gentile is in the process of learning more about the true God of the cosmos whom she's given herself over to. God the Father is Ruth's ultimate place of refuge. And she has chosen to put herself under his kanaf. Ruth did this when she made her 6-part declaration back in Moab. Then she returned to Judah with Naomi. And you know, Ruth did not do this passively, if you recall. She insisted upon it. She glued herself to Naomi and to Jehovah, and she would not take no for an answer. She attached herself to God and to his people, and she would not let go, no matter how logical and practical Naomi's argument against this course of action seemed. Well, in Ruth chapter 3, which of course we'll get back to and study in a lot more depth, Ruth now thrusts herself upon Boaz and essentially insists that Noah be her kanaf on earth. Ruth didn't sneak into the place Boaz was sleeping and crawl under his robe to take no for an answer. And essentially, Ruth tells him, you know what, man? You're obligated to redeem me. Because you, sir, are my Goel, my kinsman redeemer. We're going to talk a lot about this kinsman redeemer thing in coming lessons. Let's get back to chapter 2. And we'll go to verse 13. Thereafter, Boaz has blessed Ruth for being so dedicated to Naomi and to the God of Israel. She responds to Boaz with, my Lord, I hope I continue pleasing you. You have comforted and encouraged me, even though I'm not one of your servants. I want to put this another way, because the intent is for us to understand her to say, you are a Jewish man with much wealth, even though I am a poor Gentile and I can offer you nothing. But you have chosen to comfort and encourage me. This ought to be every Gentile's prayer of thanksgiving to our Lord Messiah, Yeshua. In verse 14, Boaz begins to draw near to Ruth. He offers his dining table to her. Boaz was demonstrating one of the most valued qualities of a human, chesed. Chesed. He was actively showing her loving kindness. Gleaners were usually at best just left alone to fend for themselves. But Boaz instead offered Ruth food from his own table. He offered for her to dip her bread in a concoction called chometz, which is a sour sauce of sorts that is used to spice up dried bread. Not only that, but Ruth was allowed to sit with the reapers, those of higher status. They were paid wages to harvest for the owner. She was offered roasted grain, a rather standard fare for reapers during the harvest season, and she was allowed all she could eat and more. But Boaz's chesed is magnified when after the meal, Ruth gets up to go back to her gleaning job, and Boaz instructs his supervisor and reapers to allow Ruth to glean now, even from the sheaves. Now remember how we examined earlier that statement that Ruth, according to some versions, had asked to glean among the sheaves, but that problem was that the Hebrew word could have been either mirim or marim. And I said then that in the context of the statement, it demanded that the word be mirim, which just means stalks, because she would never have assumed to ask to glean among the marim, the sheaves. Well, here, Boaz is generously, amazingly generously, telling his men to have her glean among the marim, the bundled sheaves. Even more, he says, pull some of the stalks away from those bundles and let her take those too. This is a most magnanimous act of charity. And we're going to talk about another aspect of removing these stalks from the sheaf for the sake of a Gentile. We're going to save that for the next time we meet.
Help support God's people by purchasing items made by them. Merchandise with a meaning, products with a purpose. HolyLandMarketplace.com. For more teachings, visit, support, or donate at TorahClass.com. Join with us in worship and enjoy God's Word at Seed of Abraham Fellowship.